we're gonna throw two faces on the screen, and we'll throw two faces on the screen. Elijah, I'm gonna be like 50% close to my notes today, okay? So just hang with me, but I promise my cues are gonna be mostly the same. Thank you, you're a legend. Let's give it up for Elijah in the back. Okay, two faces on the screen. The gentleman on the right is a gentleman named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Both of these individuals were alive during World War II. The lady on the left is named Corrie ten Boom. Corrie ten Boom. And she was actually living in the Netherlands right at the time of the Nazi invasion in that area. And she was not a Jewish individual, but there's a story of her when she was approached by a Jewish woman. Now, remember, this is, Nazi Germany has taken over the region, so they are in charge and policing the state. And there's a story of a Jewish woman who approached Corrie and asked Corrie if she was willing to hide this woman in her home. She wanted to live in her home, and she was asking Corrie to hide her so that she would not be sent to the concentration camps. Corrie, as I already said, was not Jewish. So she had an opportunity to either help this woman or not help this woman. Helping this woman meant that she would potentially risk her own life, because if you were caught hiding Jewish individuals during this time, that was likely also a one-way ticket to the concentration camps for you as well. So she had a decision to make, and actually she lived only about a block or two away from the local police station, and this woman is asking for help, and she has to make a decision whether or not she's going to risk kind of her comfort and her safety and her preferences. This would have dramatically changed the course of her life, or if she was going to just not help this woman, and hopefully, she's able to get help from someone else. Contrast that with Dietrich's story. Dietrich he was a German professor who was living in the U.S. Right before the Second World War escalated. So he was comfortable. He did not have, he didn't have to worry about what was going on in Germany. He could have just continued building a successful and a nice life for himself here in the U.S. And he had the opportunity to just not be bothered by what was happening. But Dietrich was a Christian. Both of these individuals were Jesus followers. And he had this sense that he had to wrestle with, that he was called to return to Germany and to help the church there. If you know anything about kind of the Nazi takeover of the region, one of the areas that they tried to silence and really form was the church. They thought if we could just control the church's message and voice, then we don't have to worry about any uprisings or any revolts. And Dietrich wrestled with this, what he would describe as like a calling, to return to Germany and to actually help the church there. But remember, that meant leaving America, leaving the comfort of his own, security, not doing and pursuing the professions and the professional goals that he had for himself. It meant a total life change. And I bring up both of their scenarios because they both faced a choice kind of similar to the choice that we're going to look at in Joshua's narrative this morning. Now, I'll return to their stories in just a second, but if you have been following the story so far, we know that Joshua was called to be the leader of the nation of Israel, and he led the people across the Jordan River into the promised land. He's supposed to help with the settlement procedures that are going to occur. And after he led the people across the river, literally last week in chapter 5, we see Joshua staring at the city of Jericho. And it's in this moment where an angel shows up and an angel talks to Joshua and tells Joshua, hey, Joshua, right now, I just want you to worship. Joshua probably was looking at Jericho to develop strategies and military plans for how they're going to attack the city. And this angel showed up. And if you were here last week, the angel says, take off your shoes and just worship. And it was this symbol of how God wants to do a work in us before God does something through us. So Joshua participates in the worship experience. And then we're going to pick up the story in chapter 6 where Joshua actually is going to have an opportunity, kind of similar to Dietrich, kind of similar to Corrie, where he's going to have to choose. There's this calling from God, but it would be inconvenient. It might actually be a little illogical, and it might even put him in a little bit of danger. And he has to make a choice whether or not he's going to choose comfort and control and security, or is he going to choose what seems to be the illogical and inconvenient invitation of God. Here's how chapter 6 starts. It says, the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. So the city is all locked down. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. Now, the city of Jericho, to my knowledge, is one of the oldest cities in the entire world. In terms of inhabitants and archaeology, it's one of the oldest cities that we have kind of information about and that we know people have been residing there for thousands of years. Also, Jericho has theological significance because if you read the story of Moses, we are told that God tells the people, like, hey, I'm going to bring you into the land of Canaan, and you're actually going to drive out these communities that are practicing immorality and injustice. One of the things that the Canaanites were famous for was child sacrifice. It was just a unique problem in the land. So God using the nation of Israel to drive out these other people is kind of like God's way of bringing justice on, this nation. And in verse 2, God tells Joshua, hey, Jericho, that city that you're looking at, the first city in the land, I'm going to deliver them into your hands, which is a really nice promise. But the mission still has to be accomplished. It's kind of as if God were to tell you, hey, I have your whole future taken care of. I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to guide you. I'm going to be with you, all that stuff. And you're like, thank you, but you still have to go to school. You still have to do your homework. One day you still got to get a job. You still have to create a life for yourself, all this stuff. God tells Joshua, I'm going to give this city into your hands, but the mission still needs to be accomplished. And that's where our next set of verses comes in, because God goes on to provide information about how he wants Joshua to attack and conquer this city. And that's what we'll look at next. Joshua chapter 6, verse 3. God says, I want you to march around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. And on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Now, this story has become quite a popular story in kind of Sunday school kids environments. If you grew up in church, you probably heard, a recounting or two of the story of Joshua and the Israelites marching around the walls of Jericho and then those walls actually collapsing. It makes for a really good story. However, I think because so many of us know the way that the story ends, it can be really easy for us to kind of read over these passages and to miss the illogicalness and the strangeness to God's instructions. If you're not familiar with the story, basically what happens is God tells Joshua, these are the instructions. Joshua goes on to tell the priest and then to tell the rest of the nation, hey, God said the way we're going to take the city is to march around it 1 time a day for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, we do 7 laps. And then we're going to blow our horns. And then we're going to shout. And then the walls are going to come crashing down. And that's how we're going to conquer the city. And again, because so many of us know that's exactly what happens, like they literally follow the instructions to the T, and God ends up somehow miraculously collapsing the walls of Jericho. The Israelites go in, and they're kind of successful, and it's a success story that they end up telling. But if we were there in real time, if we were in Joshua's shoes, or if we were in anyone else's shoes in that moment, I think we would have some problems with the strategy. Because if you keep reading in the book of Joshua, the Israelites know how to do conflict. They know how to go to war. Literally in the following chapters, you see the nation run ambushes and diversion tactics in order to defeat people in battle. Like everyone knows that when you're trying to strategize for a battle, you go to battle. You don't walk around the people that you're trying to conquer. That's not a good strategy. If you just thought about you were to ask someone else for help in your life, you were to ask a teacher or a leader or a pastor or a parent, and you were to say, hey, here's this problem that I'm having. How can you help me? Like, what should I do? If you told a teacher, I need help in math, and they said, get your book and put it on the floor and then just do a couple laps around it, you're like, that's weird. If you were to tell someone, hey, I'm having a really hard time getting over my ex, and they told you just find them at school and start doing laps around them, you're like, that's going to make it worse. This is weird. But because it's in the Bible, we kind of just take it and we're like, okay, well, yeah, God said it, so that's what's supposed to happen. But I think if we were there, we might have some challenges with God. Is this really your strategy? And this brings us to one of the themes that we see in Joshua's life, which is that sometimes God actually gives really strange instructions to Joshua and the people. If you remember chapter 1, Joshua is instated as the leader of the nation. He is now politically in charge. He's in charge of government. He's in charge of the military. And God says, hey, Joshua, I want you to focus on memorizing scripture. And we read that, and again, because it's in the Bible, we're just like, oh, cool. Like, yeah, that's what we're supposed to do. But if you're in Joshua's shoes, it's like, wait, that doesn't make sense. I'm supposed to focus on the military. I'm supposed to focus on fighting and training and combat. And yet God says, memorize scripture. And here, Joshua is getting ready to conquer a city, and God says, I just want you to do laps. And that's what brings us to the main idea that I want us to just kind of consider this morning. It's on the screen, which is that God's methods may not always make sense, but his strategies always succeed. So much of the story of Jericho, it actually highlights this idea that God's methods, they do not always make sense. God, why would we march around the city walls when we're trying to conquer it? And yet we know that his strategies end up succeeding. But most of us are not going to battle. Most of us are not trying to conquer a city. So I want to give us a few more examples of where this pops up in the scriptures. For example, God's method for self-fulfillment is self-denial. If you read Jesus' words in Mark chapter 8, that he basically teaches that if we really want to experience satisfaction and happiness and authenticity, the way to do it is not through always pursuing our own desires and our own impulses, but it's actually through giving our lives over to God and living the way Jesus says. Famously, we say it in church as denying ourselves. I would say that God's method for achieving greatness is sometimes serving others. Very similar to the way that Jesus actually left heaven and left his throne room to come to earth and to be a servant and to die on a dirty, dusty cross just for us, and now we exalt him. Like, the way you and I become great isn't through elevating ourselves, it's actually through humbling ourselves and serving others. God's method for healing from an offense is forgiveness. Very often when we are hurt by someone, the thing we want to do is get revenge or to just close our heart up to them. And yet Jesus teaches us that the way we heal is actually through practicing forgiveness. And these are just examples that I want to highlight how God's methods don't always make perfect sense. Most of us would think that if we want to find self-fulfillment, then we do that through doing whatever we want whenever we want. That's our version of independence, is the ability to do what we want whenever without restriction. And Jesus' instructions are actually the opposite. Most of us would think that the way we become great is by becoming better than everyone else. And this way, we will be the best. And most of us would think that the way we heal from an offense, the way we get past it, is by just guarding our heart, by closing ourselves off, and potentially by getting back at the other person and making them feel what they've made us feel. And yet God's guidance is exactly the opposite in all of these situations. So often in life, it's very easy to think that if we are here and we want to get over here, then obviously the fastest way is going to be the best way. But sometimes, just as an expression of trust, God will invite us to take a different path. Sometimes the best thing for us, if we really want a boyfriend or a girlfriend, sometimes the best thing for us is to stay single. Sometimes the best thing for us, if we really want to kind of grow our platform and our influence in a particular season, sometimes the best thing for us is to just focus on our private life. And sometimes the best thing for us, if we really feel like, hey, I have this issue, I have this sin that I'm trying to conceal and hide and just work through, sometimes the best thing for us is actually confession and telling someone else that we need help and accountability. And the way that we figure out what God is actually asking us to do in any situation, that's a much larger topic than I have time to discuss this morning. For Joshua, it seems like an angel that represented God was speaking to him in this moment. But for us, our Bible is usually going to be the number one resource where we hear from God and kind of what he wants us to do and what his plan and purpose is for our life. But the important part about today's big idea isn't so much how do we learn what God is asking? What is God's method in this particular area? That's not my focus today. The important part of today's lesson is that we follow Joshua's example and we actually do the thing that God is asking us to do. Whether it's a practice of engagement, like joining a small group or a service team, or it's a practice of abstinence, where God is actually asking us to stop a certain behavior or to get out of a certain relationship, the only way that we will eventually experience the success that comes from God's strategies is if we're willing to follow his methods. And this is where a lot of Christians stop short of total surrender. Because as human beings, like, you know this, I don't have to articulate this or make it, give you illustrations for this. We just like being in control. We like having our way. We kind of know what we think is best and what we want to do in any given situation. But sometimes God will ask us to do things that doesn't always line up with what we think is best or what we want most. And that's when we're going to have to decide. Am I really going to trust God, or am I just going to believe in him from a distance? To return to our examples from earlier, I mentioned Dietrich's story and Corey's story. The reason their names are relevant today and the reason people still talk about them is because they each made the decision to inconvenience themselves and to follow the illogical calling and prompting of God in their own lives. For Corey, not only did she end up hiding that woman, she would go on to hide hundreds of Jewish individuals during a time of Nazi persecution, saved countless lives, and is revered today because of her faith and commitment and willingness. Dietrich actually made the decision to return to Germany, again, to put his kind of life on pause and to say, I'm going to prioritize this prompting that I feel from God. And he would go on to become, quite frankly, one of the most influential voices in the church over the past 100 years. And Joshua is someone that we talk about today. And we talk about like he's this good example of following God, partly because when God gave him strange instructions that Joshua didn't always understand or perhaps agree with, he was willing to follow him anyways. And that leads me to my kind of practical takeaway for today. Because if we haven't experienced this already, we are going to have moments in our faith journey where God calls us to march around walls, speaking metaphorically, where he calls us to do things that don't always seem to make sense. And I don't mean to suggest that God's gonna like ask you to, sacrifice your life on the altar and you're never gonna have any fun or enjoy it. That's like a weird paradigm that if you think, I would love to have a conversation with you. I mean, where God's just gonna ask us things that require us to inconvenience ourselves or require us to put our desires and our preferences to the side because he's asking us to live a certain way. Perhaps it's talking to the lonely person at school. Perhaps it's breaking away from a relationship. Perhaps it's stop obsessing so much about our image. Perhaps it's our call to stop trying to promote ourselves so much, or to actually start budgeting our money so that we can tithe and so that we can be generous, and on down the list. But the point is, when these opportunities show up, the temptation is always going to be to ignore that inner voice, to ignore perhaps what Scripture says, what we know is right or best, and to do what we think is best. But if there is any part of us that ultimately wants to follow Jesus and experience the life that he has versus our best idea of life, well, then there needs to be some moments where we're actually willing to follow through on the things that he asks us to do. I'll say it this way, we'll put it on the screen. To understand why, submit and apply. To understand why, submit and apply. A lot of times when we read things in the Bible, when we hear things in church, when we feel like we are called to live a different way from the way that we are living or the way that we want to live, the temptation is to go like, hey, well, I don't like that, or I don't agree with that, or I don't understand that. And to be honest, like, we can have conversations and we can come up with all kinds of reasons and rationales as to why God says what he says and why God has the ethics and the morals and the promptings that he does. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like if you've ever heard someone say, hey, you just had to be there. Like, we could tell you the story and we could try to make it as funny as possible and make you feel like you were included, but if you weren't there, you're not gonna get it. In a similar way, in order for us to really understand why God says what he says, we have to actually be willing to submit and apply what he says to our lives. Sometimes it looks like walking around walls. Sometimes it looks like asking for mentorship or leaders. Sometimes it looks like confessing sin when we don't want to. Sometimes it looks like removing ourselves from a relationship. It will always look different in every season depending on what God is asking us to do. But if we want to understand why, well, then there's going to be moments where we're just going to have to submit and apply. And I'll just say this is just from my personal experience. So you can find someone who contradicts me on this if you want. But in my personal experience, I never hear people, okay? And again, I live in the Christian space, but I never hear people regret moments when they decided to submit to God and apply what his word says. I don't meet those moments, or those people. I do meet people where some of their greatest regrets, and I'm really not trying to like scare you and anything, but like where some of their kind of life-changing regrets are moments where they knew what was right, but they didn't do it anyways. Where they knew, I probably shouldn't get into that car. I probably shouldn't be at that place. I probably shouldn't be in that relationship, but they stayed anyways. And then they just lived to tell the tale later. And my heart is that God actually wants a life for us that is far better than anything we can come up with, that has far more peace and joy, and I'll use the word happiness, far more satisfaction than we could conjure up on our own. And what he was trying to get Joshua and the Israelites to experience in chapter 6 is, if you will just follow my lead, you will experience my faithfulness. But that requires us to actually take steps, sometimes, to do things that seem weird and strange, and I don't always understand, I don't really like this. But in order to understand why, we have to submit and apply. So the way I'm gonna end is by giving us a moment to just reflect. And I'm gonna lead us in a prayer, so if we can close our eyes